Hello everybody. What I want to do here is go through this lab activity on the digestive system. And I'm going to start up at the mouth and we'll make our way down and end at the anus. And I'm just going to kind of talk through this stuff, so I may not necessarily go in order, but we'll get all of these questions answered. So first of all, this entire space in here represents the oral cavity. So technically all of this is the oral cavity there. But there's this large structure here taking up most of the space in the oral cavity. What's that structure in there taking up most of the space? That's the tongue. And then what we're left with is this little space right there with your mouth closed at least. And so that represents the oral cavity. Now the upper boundaries of the oral cavity is set by this right there, and this is bone, as you guys can tell. That is the hard palate, and that's made up of the maxilla and also the palatine bones. And then as you make your way posteriorly, this little section right there is the soft palate, and then this little appendage at the bottom, what number 4 is representing, that's the uvula. And what's going to happen here, just to give this a little action here, what's going to happen is that when you swallow, your tongue pushes that food bolus up against the hard palate, and that pushes the food bolus back towards the oral pharynx right there. And as that happens, this uvula moves upward and it seals off the nasal cavity from food from potentially getting up there. Making our way over to the teeth. Let's identify some teeth here. And the first thing you need to do is you need to find the mid-sagittal line. You need to find the line that runs right down the middle of the body. And so that, it might be a little difficult on this diagram, is right there. And then down below, it's a little more difficult. I believe that's right there. Different color here. So there's our mid-sagittal line. And what we want to do is we want to start medial and just move our way laterally. So these first two teeth there, what are these first two teeth? Those are incisors. And what does that make number 5? That is that's the lateral incisor. This is the medial incisor. Number 5 is the lateral incisor. After the incisors, we have number 6. What's number 6? That's the canine. After the canines, we have these two teeth there. What are those, including number 7? Those are premolars. And then we have 3 teeth at the back, and we can only see 2. And those are the molars. And that third molar is the wisdom tooth. So it's quite possible that they, on this model, they indicated to take out that third molar, the wisdom tooth. Okay, the next part that we want to deal with here is the throat. And there's 3 parts to the throat, 8, 9, and 10. And the upper part of the throat, number 8, is the nasopharynx, because it's associated with the nasal cavity. And I should say that the official name for the throat is the pharynx. So here we have the nasopharynx. Below that, number 9, we have the oropharynx, because it's associated with the oral cavity. And then lastly, number 10, we have the laryngopharynx, because it's associated with the larynx. This whole structure there is the larynx. So again, what happens during swallowing is the food bolus gets pushed down back towards the oropharynx, and at the same time this is happening, the entire larynx lifts upward, and meanwhile the tongue pushes backwards. And what that does is it takes this structure right there, number 11, and it causes it to bend over, and by doing so it seals off the larynx. And what that's doing is it's preventing food, it's causing food to go down the esophagus here and preventing it from going into the larynx and into the respiratory tract. So number 11 is the epiglottis. Now we're dealing with some accessory organs that are part of the digestive system, but they're accessory and they lie outside of the oral cavity. So this is number 12, 13, and 14. And collectively, these are salivary glands. So we're going to identify each of those, and also the ducts that take that saliva into the oral cavity. So we'll start with this guy here. This is the largest, and this salivary gland is really superficial. It's right underneath the skin. You can see this is the superficial masseter right there, and it lies on top of the superficial masseter. And so this large salivary gland that's just in front of the ear is the parotid gland. And then this tube right here is the parotid duct that's going to take that saliva from the parotid gland and secrete that into the oral cavity. Let's move on over here. And number 14, this is a little difficult to decipher here, but you can see right there, that's the mandible. And what I've done is faded it so you can see through the mandible. And so this salivary gland number 14 is in proximity to the mandible. And that's the submandibular gland. And then you can see this long duct that takes that and secretes that saliva into the oral cavity, and it secretes it right out from underneath the tongue. So that's the submandibular duct. And then I don't have this one labeled here, but we have this guy right there, and that's right underneath the tongue. That's the sublingual gland. And there's a whole series of ducts that secrete that underneath the tongue into the oral cavity. Now we're looking at the torso model here. By the way, this model we looked at initially, this is the mid-sagittal head model. And it's called that because this is it's the head, and they basically took a mid-sagittal plane. It's cut right down the middle, and then we have a sagittal view here. This is the torso model here, and let's just orient ourselves a little bit. First of all, that structure right there is part of the larynx, and that's part of the respiratory system. And specifically, these two flat plates of cartilage on the anterior side of it, those are the thyroid cartilages, and you can palpate those. Those correspond to your Adam's apple. And also the epiglottis is part of the larynx there. Now, right below the larynx, we have this structure. And just looking at it, it looks like glandular tissue. And in fact, that's what that is. And specifically, that's the thyroid gland. Now, the thyroid gland is not part of the digestive system. In fact, the thyroid gland is part of the endocrine system. And what the thyroid gland is going to do is it's going to produce thyroid hormone, and thyroid hormone is the major metabolic hormone of the body. Thyroid hormone is going to act on the cells of the body, and it's going to stimulate those cells to stimulate cellular respiration. And so it's going to stimulate the conversion of glucose to ATP. And the endocrine system is what we're going on to next, and so I wanted to include that here. But now back to the digestive system. So we had that food bolus that was swallowed, and it went from the throat, and now it needs to get from the throat, and it needs to go down the neck through the thoracic cavity and into the abdominal cavity where all the action's happening. And so the structure that's going to deliver that food bolus is represented right there, but it also continues in back of the trachea there all the way up. So number 16 there is the esophagus. And this is a relatively thick muscular tube that's going to propel that food bolus down through the neck and into the abdominal cavity. And that's going to occur by, what's the motion that's going to take that food bolus down through the esophagus? That's peristalsis, and that is caused by the enteric nervous system, the nervous system that exists within the walls of the nervous system. All right. So there we have the esophagus. And the next place the esophagus goes is into this structure right there, which we'll identify on a later picture. But here we have some other accessory digestive organs that are visible here. Number 17. Number 17 is the liver. And what digestive function does the liver have? The liver is going to produce bile. And bile is going to travel down the bile duct, and it's going to go into the duodenum, and it's going to emulsify fats. Now, any bile that's not immediately used backs up, and it gets stored in that structure right there, which is the gallbladder. All right, so here we go. The food bolus travels down the esophagus. It goes through the diaphragm, and now it's in the abdominal cavity. And then it goes into structure number 19, which is the stomach. And over here, we opened up that stomach. And let's see, the esophagus is right there. So the esophagus would come down like so. And something that's not really shown here, but that would be the lower esophageal sphincter. And then that means on this end, that's the pyloric end of the stomach. Number 20 is the pyloric sphincter. Now, if you look inside the stomach, you'll notice that the mucosa is thrown into these folds right there. And what do we call those folds? Those are rugae. And they do a few things. You know, they increase the surface area of the mucosal surface area of the stomach. And they also allow for stretch. So the stomach can fill with food, and those rugae are able to flatten out, and that allows the stomach to stretch. And there's also stretch receptors in there that take that information to the brain and stimulate feelings of satiety. From the stomach, that material, and that material is now called chyme. So there's mechanical breakdown that occurs in the stomach, there's mixing that occurs, and it takes that food bolus and it mixes it up with gastric juice to make this paste, and we call that paste chyme. And so chyme gets secreted in small amounts through the pyloric sphincter into this next structure right there, which is part of the small intestine. And that first little part of the small intestine, it's the smallest part, and it's shaped like a C here, is the duodenum. And the duodenum is only like 8 inches long, I believe. Another way you can recognize the duodenum is that this structure right there, what is that structure? That's the pancreas. The head of the pancreas here nestles in this C that's created by the duodenum there. And so they're anatomically associated with each other. And the pancreas is going to produce, the pancreas is actually part of the endocrine system and the digestive system. The digestive component of the pancreas is going to produce pancreatic juice, and that pancreatic juice, first of all, is alkaline because the chyme coming from the stomach is acidic, and we want to neutralize that pH. And it also has a whole host of digestive enzymes in there. And these digestive enzymes, unlike pepsin in the stomach, these digestive enzymes work best at about pH 7. And so that's why we need to neutralize that pH. And that's why the pancreatic juice is alkaline. But that pancreatic juice needs to be secreted into the duodenum. How's it going to do that? Well, all of that material is eventually secreted into this tube right there. And that tube deposits that material, that pancreatic juice, in the duodenum. So number 25 there is the pancreatic duct. So let's see, 24 is the pancreas, 25 is the pancreatic duct, 22 is the duodenum. What about this structure over here in the upper left quadrant? And by the way, the stomach is taken out here, but the stomach would be, you know, something right about there. The stomach's been taken out. So number 23, which is associated anatomically with the stomach, that's the spleen. And the spleen is part of the lymphatic system. It's not part of the digestive system, but we're going to talk about the spleen in the next set of material. So I just want you guys to know where that's at. It does not have a digestive role. Okay, then we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but I just put this here. This is the large intestine, and it's kind of the border between the descending colon and the sigmoid colon here. But anyways, the large intestine is made up of these pouches here. You have these the large intestine is thrown into these pouches. And what are these called? Those are called haustra. And the material going through the large intestine is going to collect in there. It's going to compact in there. All sorts of stuff like that. I'm going to go down here and then come back to the slide above this. Here's the stomach. And if we were to open up the abdominal cavity and just take a look at what's in there, the first thing we would see is this structure right there, which is kind of like a bib. It's this bib that covers all of the, or most of the digestive viscera. And that bib is called the greater omentum. And that's a mesentery. It's a fusion of the serous membranes. And that's going to contain fat. There's going to be blood vessels that go through there, that go to the digestive organs. There, it provides padding, it provides cushion, all sorts of stuff like that. But to see stuff underneath it, you have to reflect it up. And that's what we're showing right here. Now in the previous, what we just went over before, there's the stomach. There's the C of the duodenum. You can see the pancreas wrapped in the duodenum there. And the duodenum continues on and it becomes the next part of the small intestine, which is all this area in green. That's the jejunum. And so what happens is that in the duodenum, that's where we get the mixing of bile, pancreatic juice, and chyme, and it all gets mixed together by segmentation, and then it makes its way down to the jejunum by peristalsis. And the jejunum is where, by that time, all of it's mixed together, and that's where the majority of digestion and absorption is going to occur, is in the jejunum here. And that's a much larger section of small intestine. I just want to guess it's like 10 feet or something to that effect. And after the jejunum, the next part of the small intestine is all of this right here. It's kind of hard to see where they merge together, but that is the ileum. And the ileum's another long portion of the small intestine, maybe 8 to 10 feet, something like that, maybe 12 feet. And the ileum is basically going to absorb anything that wasn't absorbed in the jejunum. Then that material goes from the ileum and it goes into the large intestine, but to do so, it has to pass through this valve right there. And that valve is actually a sphincter. It's a sphincter that's called a valve. That's the ileocecal valve. If you can read my handwriting there. That's the ileocecal valve. All right, back up to this diagram. And again, we've taken out a few things here, the greater omentum, the small intestine. But what you can see is that this little last part there is the ileum, and the ileum deposits that chyme into the large intestine. This whole thing here is the large intestine, but it's broken down into different sections. So the first part of the large intestine is this right here, and this is where the chyme from the ileum is being deposited. And that's called the cecum. So chyme is going from the ileum into the cecum, and to get there it passes through the ileocecal valve. And this is kind of a storage area. This is where chyme is just getting stored. Then that material starts to move through the large intestine, and the first part it goes through is number 28 here. This is called the ascending colon. Then it goes through this section right there, which is the transverse colon. Then it goes through this section right there, number 30, which is the descending colon. And then what happens is the colon moves from the front of the body towards the back, and it does this S-shaped kind of thing. And that is called the sigmoid colon. And that is what we're looking at right here. You have the descending colon that comes down, and then the descending colon becomes this S-shaped portion that moves towards the back, and again, that's the sigmoid colon. And on this diagram, the sigmoid colon is right there. The sigmoid colon gives way to this area, number 35. That's the rectum. And by the way, you know, what's happening is this material is moving through the large intestine. Well, what we're doing, most of the absorption has already taken place. And so what we're doing is we're compacting that and getting it ready to be eliminated from the body as feces. And one of the main things that we need to take from that is water. So the large intestine is absorbing water, it's compacting it, and it's making feces. And then that feces, before defecation, gets stored in the rectum. So that's the rectum right there. And this next section this whole thing there, but just a little of it is highlighted there. That whole thing is the anal canal. And surrounding the anal canal is that thing right there, which corresponds to number 36, and that is the internal anal sphincter. And what type of muscle is that internal anal sphincter made out of? That's smooth muscle, which means it's going to be under involuntary control. And by default, that thing is closed. And what's going to happen is when we have stretch in the rectum, that's going to go through a nervous system pathway that's going to cause that internal anal sphincter to relax and allow that feces to be eliminated from the body. Then the last little section here is the anus. So the anal canal gives way to the last little section, which is the anus. And then lastly, let me redo that. That's the internal anal sphincter. But what about this thing right there that's wrapping around the anal canal as well? There's a reason it doesn't show up when you hit digestive system on essential anatomy, and that's because it's not smooth muscle, it's actually skeletal muscle. What is that thing? That is the external anal sphincter. And again, that's skeletal muscle, so that's under voluntary control. So if your rectum is full of feces and the internal anal sphincter is open and it wants to come out, but it's not convenient to defecate, then you have conscious control over this external anal sphincter there, and you can cause that to contract, pucker up your bunghole, and buy yourself a little time. Now let's look at some histology. And we're going to start by looking at a cross-section of the small intestine. And something to keep in mind is that the alimentary canal, all the way from the mouth, all the way down to the anus, is composed of the same 4 layers. The same 4 layers make up the entire length of the alimentary canal. Now there's modifications in that layer, and some layers may look different in one area than the other, but they're all made up of the same 4 layers, and that's what I want to identify here. So first of all, this is the lumen. That's the open tube where the food is going to pass down, and this place where the chyme is going to pass down. And if we start at the lumen, we can just work our way from there out and start identifying layers. This first layer here, number 1, is the mucosal layer. That's the mucosa. And within the mucosa, there's all sorts of substructures. These little finger-like projections right out there, those are called villi. And we'll take a close-up look at those here in just a second. The next layer, this layer right there underneath the mucosa, is the submucosa. And the submucosas are reeler tissue. And reeler tissue is loose connective tissue. A lot of blood vessels can pass through there. And another thing you might notice is it kind of looks like maybe you have all this open space here. One thing about loose connective tissue is that when you prepare histology, it's really easy for that loose connective tissue to get torn apart a little bit. So all this white space here is probably just area where the areolar tissue got separated a little bit. After the submucosa, we have these two layers right there. That is the muscularis externa. And the muscularis externa is made up of two different layers. Color I haven't done here yet. You can kind of distinguish those. This is one layer, number 3. And then this is another layer, number 4. And looking over here, these are those layers at a higher magnification. So what is number 3 here? What specific layer within the muscularis externa is that? That's the intercircular layer. And the way you can envision this is that the intercircular layer, those smooth muscle cells, wrap around in a circular fashion. So when you take a cross section of it, you can still see these individual smooth muscle cells there because they're running in a circular direction around the lumen. What about this outer layer here, number 4? That is the outer longitudinal layer. And the smooth muscle cells in that layer, try to draw it 3D here, are running the length of the alimentary canal. So when you take a cross section, like we have, when you take a cross section, you're cutting through each of these individual smooth muscle cells, and so all you see here are cross sections of smooth muscle cells. So if you can visualize that, then that's a way to distinguish between those two layers. And then the last layer, which is represented by number 5 here, and that's just a thin little, it's basically the outer line of the alimentary canal. That's the serosa. And the reason it's just a little line here is because that's just a thin layer of simple squamous epithelium with a thin layer of areolar tissue underneath that. So that corresponds to the serous membrane that's surrounding the small intestine, which is specifically called the visceral peritoneum. Now we're looking at the small intestine again, but now we're looking at a close-up of the mucosa layer. This entire layer here is the mucosa, and then you can start to see the submucosa that's underneath it. By the way, the mucosa is composed of an epithelial layer and then a small layer of connective tissue underneath that. And you can distinguish that here. That's the epithelium that's lining the small intestine, and then the areolar tissue is right underneath it there. And when nutrients are absorbed, they're going to travel across these epithelial cells, and they're going to be absorbed in the capillaries that are running through this areolar tissue in the mucosa. those blood vessels that are traveling through the submucosa, what they do is when they get to where they need to go, they take a right turn, they make their way up this mucosa, and they thin out and they become capillaries. So this is where we have capillaries that are going to absorb nutrients from the digestive tract. Okay, so what are these finger-like projections here that are extending into the lumen that are increasing the surface area of the epithelial lining? That's a villi. And these villi are lined by epithelium. What type of epithelium lines the small intestine? That's simple columnar epithelium, and interspersed within the simple columnar epithelium are those guys right there, which are goblet cells, mucus-producing cells. Now we are looking at histology of the esophagus. And there's the lumen of the esophagus. And it's giving you the layers here already. That's the mucosa layer. And the mucosa layer, well, let's just go through this first. There's the mucosa layer. Underneath that is the submucosa. Underneath that, you get into the muscularis externa. Back to the mucosa. The mucosa, again, has an epithelial component, and that's this right here. What's that epithelium that's lining the esophagus? That's stratified squamous epithelium. And why do we have stratified squamous epithelium there? That's for protection. Protection from the food and the chemicals that are traveling down the esophagus. Over to this histology. Here we are. This is the mucosa. And then all of this would be the submucosa. And within the submucosa, we have these structures right there. Do I have a close-up? I don't have a close-up picture of those. But I will tell you that each of these, there's a little lumen there. And then the lumen is surrounded by epithelial cells. And those are simple cuboidal epithelial cells. Now, what do we call these structures in the submucosa of the esophagus? Those are esophageal glands. And what are they going to produce? They're going to produce mucus. So those are mucus-producing cells, and then ducts are going to take that mucus and secrete it onto the epithelium here. Because remember, the digestive tract, the whole thing is a mucous membrane. The entire thing's going to be lined by mucus. And one thing about stratified squamous epithelium is that you don't find any goblet cells in there. Those are constantly being turned over. There's stem cells down there, constantly producing new epithelial cells. And that's just not a good environment for the goblet cells to live in. They'd be pushed out into the lumen. And so what they do is they have these esophageal glands that are producing the mucus that's going to line the esophagus.